Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. For today's card, I used the Christmas Cheer stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I took the sign pole, the Santa, and the Christmas tree, and I stamped them onto some Bristol smooth paper using Gina K amalgam ink. The reason I'm using Bristol smooth paper is because I'm going to be coloring these in with my Arteza real brush pens, and I find that Bristol smooth paper is the best paper for these markers. I find that it's a lot more difficult to blend the Arteza markers on other papers, especially if you're coloring with the markers directly on the paper. If you want to know any of the colors that I used, I do have the colors up in the left-hand corner of the screen. For Santa's suit, I only used one color, the red color. Normally when I'm coloring in large areas, I like to use more than one color, but I decided to just use the one because I thought it looked pretty good when I was done with that color. One of the really great things about the Arteza markers is you can get away with only using one color because when you use your water brush and you blend out the color, it lightens it and then you have a light area and a dark area. The water brush that I used to blend out my Arteza markers is the Tim Holtz Fine Detailer water brush. Now I actually don't have any water inside of my water brush. Personally, I'm not very good at using water brushes and controlling the amount of water that comes out of them. Some people might find it easier, but for me, I prefer to use a regular brush. But for my Arteza marker coloring, I actually really like the tip on this particular water brush, and so that's why I use it. So I colored in Santa's suit, and then I took the same red and colored in every other stripe on the pole, and then I used a really light blue color, which is almost like a gray blue, and I colored in the other stripes on the pole with that one. For Santa's boots, belt, and gloves, I used a really dark gray marker and a straight up black marker. For the list that Santa Claus is holding, which I'm assuming is the naughty or nice list, I really wanted the paper to look like old parchment, so I'm using some really light brown colors. When you're coloring in a curved item like the paper, you want to kind of try to follow the curve of the actual item with your marker strokes in order to really make it look 3D and like it's actually curved. Once I was happy with the coloring on the paper, I took a darker brown marker and I added some squiggly lines to look like words. For the area underneath Santa Claus, I wasn't exactly sure what he was supposed to be standing on, so I decided to make it look like ice. I think that area could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. It really just depends on the imagination of the crafter. Seeing as I knew I was doing an outdoor scene, I thought it made the most sense to have it be a little patch of ice. For Santa Claus's beard and the furry parts of his hat and suit, I didn't want to leave them just plain white, so I took my lightest color gray and I added a very small amount for shading. It's very subtle, but I think that it makes it look a lot better than it would look if it was just plain white. I decided to use the same exact colors that I used on the paper that Santa Claus is holding on the signs that are on the post. I think that using a lot of the same colors throughout your card really ties the images together and makes them look like they're supposed to go together. I tried to give the signs some texture to make them look a little bit more like wood by adding some lines coming in from each side, and then I didn't fully blend those lines out so that you can still see them a little bit. The last thing that I did for my signs was take my darkest brown color and I outlined the two bottom ones and I kind of added a drop shadow to the top one. I think that this really helps the signs to pop a little bit. For the Christmas tree, I used forest green, which is a really dark green color. So if you look at this tree, you can see that there are 3 defined sections. If you look at the top section, I added my color right underneath the star, and then I blended that color out to the bottom of the section, and it slowly gets lighter as it goes down. For the middle section, I did the same thing, except for I added my color right underneath the top section. And then I did the same thing for the third section, except for I also added a shadow right underneath the third section, which is also right underneath the tree. So basically you want to think of what areas of the tree are underneath, and you want to shade those areas. I'm not sure if the little circles around the tree are supposed to be lights or some kind of ornament, but really that doesn't matter because you can interpret them either way, and I decided to color them in all red. I found this tree a little daunting at first because it was very stylized and I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to do the shading, but once I started coloring it in, I figured it out pretty quickly and I think it came out pretty good. Again, here with the trunk of the tree, you'll see that I'm carrying across that same brown color that I used on the other two images. Finally, I couldn't forget to add a little bit of pink to Santa Claus's cheeks and nose. Once the coloring was done, I used my scan and cut to fussy cut the images out, and then I started working on a background. The paper that I'm using for this background is Bristol Smooth paper, and I'm blending some Distress Oxide inks. Distress Oxide inks blend really well on most kinds of paper, but I find that they blend extremely well on Bristol Smooth paper, but it does take a little bit longer for them to dry, so make sure you give them a decent amount of time. The colors that I'm using to blend a wintry sky are Tumbled Glass, Salty Ocean, Blueprint Sketch, and Black Soot. As you can see, I don't blend all the way down the paper, and that's because I know that I'm going to be covering up the bottom, so I don't need to blend there. At this point, I was looking at that Christmas tree that I colored in, and I wanted it to be a slightly different shade, so I took a mint green Arteza marker and I just went over the whole thing. I didn't want the circle around the bottom of the tree for this particular card, so I took some scissors and I cut the circle out, and then I used a white gel pen to color in the remaining lines. Using some large scissors, I cut a curvy line across a piece of Bristol Smooth paper in order to create some snowy hills. To add some shading to this piece, I took the Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink and I just blended a little bit of that along the bottom edge. I picked out a bunch of the snowflakes from the stamp set that I was using earlier, and I stamped them along the top of that Distress Oxide panel. I stamped those with Simon Says Stamp embossing ink, and then I embossed them with Brutus Monroe Marshmallow Puff embossing powder. This embossing powder is from Brutus Monroe's Embossing Powder of the Month Club for the month of December. Even though I used a powder tool, some of the embossing powder stuck to areas where I didn't want it to, so I had to use a dry paintbrush in order to brush it away. Now, the really cool thing about this embossing powder is when you heat it up, it kind of puffs up, so you have a really nice texture. I popped up that panel with some foam tape onto a Nina Desert Storm cardstock base, and then I took the snowy hills that I created earlier and I glued them down to the bottom of that panel with my ATG gun. So you've probably noticed by now that this is not an A2 size card. The actual dimensions for this card are 9.5 by 4. I took my white gel pen and I filled in all of the empty spaces in the sky with some little dots, and these could be either snow or stars. I used a couple of the stamps from the stamp set to fill in the signs so that it says, "This way to the North Pole." Alright, so it's time to start adhering the pieces. So I took the Santa and the sign and I popped them up onto the card with some foam tape. In order to kind of create the illusion of depth, I didn't pop up the Christmas tree. Instead, I glued it down with my Gina K Connect glue so that it's flat against the card. I used my N0 Copic marker to add some drop shadows beneath the Christmas tree and the sign. For the sentiment on my card, I used the stamp which says Merry Christmas, and I embossed it with Alabaster embossing powder onto some cherry red cardstock from Gina K Designs. And you'll notice that I mounted that on a piece of vellum and then popped it up onto the card. For some finishing touches on the card, I added some highlights and details with my white gel pen. I also used glossy accents on the red circles around the tree, the star, and the top of the sign pole. Of course, I had to add some sparkle, so I took my Wink of Stella glitter brush and I went over the sentiment strip. I was going to go over the pole, but because I used Arteza markers, it started to reactivate the color and the red started blending into the white areas, and I didn't want that. So instead, I went over the white areas on Santa's hat. I also went over the top of the snow and a little bit on the Christmas tree. Finally, the last thing that I did to finish up this card is I took my unicorn glitter glaze and I went along the tops of each of the signs to make them look like they're kind of frosted. I just took some of that glitter glaze onto the very tip of my palette knife and just kind of dabbed it where I wanted the glitter glaze to go. And because I just couldn't stop embellishing this card, I also added some of that glitter glaze to the top of the pole and a very little bit onto the side of the tree. After that, this card was all done, and here's a closer look at the finished card, and you can see all of those beautiful details. Thank you for watching today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design featuring the stamp set from Simon Says Stamps December Card Kit. All of the supplies that I used for this card can be found in the description down below. If you enjoyed watching and you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button so that you can see all of my future videos. I'm going to be back with a new card video on Monday. Again, thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a good weekend.